Hey guys, Tim Smith here with the long-awaited, much-promised video series on preparing for the Boreal Snowshoe expedition. So the first thing that we're going to tackle here is footwear. Footwear is probably the most important technical bit that you're going to have on the trip, and it's going to be the difference between warm, happy feet and cold, miserable feet. So let's jump right into it. I know some of you guys don't have a lot of time, so if you only had one pair of footwear that you were going to bring on this trip, here it is, right? This is a tingly rubber boot. It's like a rubber over boot. There's nothing inside. There's no structure to it. Another option would be one of these military surplus over boots, nothing inside, right? So we'd have one of these with some sort of liner that goes in the bottom, and then a big thick felt liner. Right? So this together, I've worn these things for weeks on end, and as long as you can dry them out at night, dry out the liners, you're good to go. So if you're only going to watch one little bit, you know, that's it. These things, the over boots, don't go over your regular boots, right? They are the boot. So this whole thing is like wearing a slipper all winter. So if you're just going to get one, that's it. But now let's get into the nuts and bolts of it. So number one, why do feet get cold in the wintertime? So number one reason, lack of insulation, and that's to the outside and even more so to the ground below you. You lose a lot of heat to conduction to the ground below you. So another reason your feet get cold in the wintertime is if you're wearing tight, restrictive boots. You know, if you think about like a plastic ski boot or something and you just keep jamming on extra pairs of socks because your feet are cold, it's going to compress your feet and therefore restrict blood flow to that extremity, and that makes you cold. Number three is if your insulation layers get wet, and especially if they stay wet, meaning day after day. Something that we don't really take into account with our modern footwear is that each foot, even if it's not sweating, gives off in the neighborhood of a quarter cup of moisture a day just to keep your skin supple. So you've got to deal with that moisture. And lastly, a big factor is dehydration in the wintertime. If your blood's really thick, it has trouble getting from the power plant in your core here out to the extremities. And, you know, diet can have an impact on that as well. So when we're talking about footwear, especially in the winter, and really just winter camping in bitter cold conditions at all, the biggest thing that we need to keep in mind is moisture management. So, as I mentioned, your foot gives off moisture, and as long as we know that, we've got to deal with it. So, briefly, there's two different environments that we have the potential to be traveling in the wintertime. Environment number one would be dry cold, and figure that's somewhere between colder than say 5 to maybe around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere in there is the changeover. If it's colder than that, so say if it's 20 below zero, we're in a really dry cold environment. The other end of the extreme is wet cold, and figure that's anything above 10 degrees Fahrenheit and warmer. There's a lot of moisture available in the snow at those temperatures, so that's a really wet cold environment. And the idea is that we're going to dress appropriately for each specific environment with regards to footwear. So in a wet cold environment, I want something like this rubber boot, this tingly rubber boot, that's going to inhibit any moisture from the outside getting in, right? So my feet will stay dry. Imagine rubber rain boots or something like that. You know, you don't get wet from the outside. But we still have to take into account that our feet are giving off moisture, and we need to deal with that. So, as I said, I've worn these rubber boots every day, all winter, bitter cold conditions. But the trick is I need to be able to pull my liners out at night, and I need to be able to dry them out. As an experiment one year, I didn't do that, and I just kept leaving my liners in my boots here. And after 2 days, it was like putting on a big block of ice. All that moisture got in my liners and froze. So after 2-3 days in bitter cold conditions, they don't keep you warm at all. So, but even in the bitter cold conditions, if I can pull my liners out and dry them out once a day or once every other day, they're going to do me really well, which is why if you had to bring one pair of boots, this is going to be it. So in dry cold conditions, the traditional footwear are these mucklucks, right? This is a pair made by Anna Bosom, a Cree friend of mine in northern Quebec. Here's the commercial version. This is a Steger muckluck, and you can see this one has a rubber bottom for walking in town, but it's moose hide usually with a canvas upper. And the idea is that this is 100% moisture permeable. So if I wore these in wet, cold conditions and stepped into a puddle, my foot's going to be soaked right away. But the genius of this type of footwear is if I'm in really dry, cold conditions, the moisture generated by my foot is vented through the footwear as a gas. As a result, I don't need to worry as much about drying out my liners. My liners should stay super dry unless I step into a puddle or something. You know, that moisture is vented as a gas. So that's the big difference between dry cold and wet cold footwear. So let's get down to brass tacks. Specific criteria and components for your winter footwear that you're going to bring. If you had to bring just one, again, a rubber boot. This is an overboot or a military surplus overboot. These are pretty cheap. I think these things are like 30, 35 bucks, and obviously surplus stuff depends on where you're shopping. I've seen them as cheap as 8 bucks. Maybe you spend 20 or 30. I don't know. Directly inside of your wet weather footwear, you need some sort of a liner. You know, you're going to lose a lot of heat to conduction to the ground. This is a great one. It's a bunch of little pieces of plastic mesh sewn together around the edge. You know, you can also stuff dried grass in the bottom. I like to find boot liners that don't absorb moisture. So felt liners are great, but you know, at the end of the day, they're usually frozen to the inside of your boot. Lastly, a really good thick pair of felt boot liners, right? These things, they'll go in, they'll come out, we'll dry them out at night. Thicker they are, the more insulation there is. So in addition to, you know, here's your footwear, pretty bomb-proof, you're also going to want to spend some money on decent socks. I think a couple of good pairs of really thick wool socks, they're worth their weight in gold. And always have the best pair of socks that you have. You're never going to wear them during the day. Before you go to bed at night, you're going to take your sleep socks out of your bag. You're going to put them on your feet. They're going to be bone dry, no moisture, no salts in them, no nothing. And they're going to keep your feet warm through the overnight. So if you don't go with this style of footwear for the trip, you know, a big, huge criteria, make sure your boots have removable liners. Just about every year we have somebody who says, I'm going to wear these boots I've had. They're really warm. They're great. I've used them for years. After 4 days on the trail, those boots are usually saturated with moisture. And if you can't pull the liners out, they take a long time to dry. So don't let that be you. Make sure that you have removable liners, right? So yeah, that's it for footwear. Well, I guess one last plug. If you're going to get 2 pairs, you know, you get the stuff for wet cold first, and then you get the stuff for dry cold. And these things are great. These Steger mucklucks, they're really expensive, but man, they're sure comfortable, and they'll sure keep you warm down to bitter, bitter cold conditions. So that's footwear. Next, we're going to look at sleeping bags.